well, okay, we actually have to contend now with the possibility of a collapse of the Russian government, possibly a breakup of Russia. How safe are the nukes? And the answer is, thankfully, for now, they're pretty safe, because we have this, very well run team looking after them. I think the question is, how long would that last if you had a disorderly breakdown and a power struggle or a civil war?
So, who are the men who look after the nuclear warheads in Russia, the 12th Gumo?
So the Russia's nuclear weapons are looked after by an elite unit of the Russian army called the 12th Dumo, the 12th Chief Directorate. It's a group of about 30 to 40,000 men. The officers are handpicked from the top military academies by the generals who run it. And they essentially live their lives entirely separately from not just from the rest of the military, but from the population. They and their families live separately on military bases. Um, there are even separations within the units of the 12th Gumo. So, for example, communication or information is very tightly guarded between units. So often a unit may be transporting a warhead, or they don't even know if they're transporting a warhead. They don't know what they're loading onto a train. They're not allowed to really talk. The truck crew isn't allowed to talk to the train crew. So they're really a unit that has been, unlike the rest of the Russian army, as we've seen in Ukraine, which is really dilapidated, corrupt, starved of funding and equipment and training. The 12th Gumo are not like that. They have been prioritized for funding and training. And indeed, up till 2014, they received billions in aid from the US, and also in training from the US in how to look after nuclear weapons. So these are the elite guys who make sure the warheads don't go missing.
And they're kind of, yeah, they're like this last sound Russian military institution. That's kind of what you were saying in the article, right?
Yes. So, like I said, the Russian military has really not covered itself in glory through the course of the Ukraine war. Putin has gone through now. He's on his fourth commander for the war effort. He's just using the commander in chief of the whole military at the moment, Gerasimov. Whereas the 12th Gumo is very different. It's had the same commander since 2017. The commander before that served for a long time, and so it has an element of almost otherworldly stability to it, compared to everything else about the Russian government, which is really, even its propaganda with respect to people is almost aimed at keeping people in a constant state of uncertainty, and lack of clarity about what's true and what's not. The 12th Gumo is different. It's a highly disciplined force that has one mission. It's very clear, and it's been kept to that really since well, at least since the 90s and perhaps before.
Would you say, I mean, because the 12th Gumo has stayed basically as it is since prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's kind of one of the last parts of the Kremlin that stayed the same throughout that part of history. Has Russia, do you think, outgrown the processes of the 12th Gumo?
No, I think not. So yeah, the 12th Guma grew out of. I think there were a couple of different parts of the military in the 1940s when Russia really started its nuclear program, that were combined to form this unit. But under the Soviet Union, management of nukes was quite different, because you could have whole cities that were out of bounds for ordinary citizens, because you needed papers to be able to move around, and you couldn't go there without permission. Whereas when the Soviet Union collapsed, the big difference was that they had to start learning to keep nuclear weapons in guarded bases, with fences, and how to manage who could get in, how to manage the defense of the bunker if someone did get in, how to manage, calling for help if they were, say a separatist militia was trying to get hold of a nuke. A lot of their training was around, related to how they would defend their bunker, and or the weapons, and at all costs prevent them from going missing. So So they have changed actually, uh, and the standard I think has risen a lot. And the people that I spoke to who were American military advisors involved in training this unit through the 90s and the 2000s, have witnessed that change. The learning to deal with a completely new way of managing security and successfully doing that.
Would you say that kind of the very high standards that this Soviet era 12th Gumo is held to versus what some would say are the very low standards that the Russian military, especially in Ukraine, is held to, kind of shows how the Russian military has maybe declined since the collapse of the Soviet Union?
Yeah, well, it's certainly, well, I suppose we don't, the last war that the Russian military had fought, well, there's the Chechnya War, but there was Afghanistan, where they also didn't do too well. So it's hard to say whether the military overall has declined. Certainly, our perception of it has declined, given the results of the war in Ukraine. But, there was a period when Putin was intervening in Syria, in Libya, well, the Wagner Group in Libya, when actually perceptions of Russian military strength were very high. And countries like India based their whole weapons procurement program around this assumption. Many of those ideas have now been revised. But throughout it all, I think what's interesting about the 12th Gumo is it really tells you that the people in charge, that Putin and Yeltsin view this as an essential tool to their power and their security. And that is why it has been protected from the ravages of corruption or decline that have happened elsewhere. Because, the guy who has his finger on the nuclear button can hold everyone else and the world to ransom. And so it signals how essential they are to the structure of power, not just in Russia, but in any country that had an arsenal of 5,000 nuclear weapons.
And maybe if Prigozhin had been successful last weekend with his attempted mutiny on Moscow, and he had gotten access to the 12th Gumo, maybe it wouldn't. Maybe it would have declined had his or the prestige of it, I guess, if he had used his military tactics.
Well, I think that it's actually interesting. The more you look into it, the more I actually think that Prigozhin was telling the truth when he said this wasn't a coup. I think what was actually motivating it was fear for their lives. The Wagner groups used to being this autonomous unit that operates in other countries. Instead, they found themselves nailed down to a defensive line in Ukraine. They're being starved of ammunition because why would the rest of the Russian military prioritize these mercenaries? And they're starting to feel maybe like a sacrificial lamb and the whole thing. And this was a sort of march for, he called it a march for justice, which is given who the Wagner guys are and how like brutal and murderous and awful they are is kind of ironic, but that's how he saw it. So, putting that aside, the question of if we see a disorderly transfer of power in Russia, which is now looks very possible because this march has revealed how fragile Putin's hold is. The panic that he displayed last Saturday when it happened, the fact that no one stopped Wagner Group from marching to within 200 miles of, or closer, I think, to Moscow. So that's why this is something I looked into. Is well, okay, we actually have to contend now with the possibility of a collapse of the Russian government, possibly a breakup of Russia. How safe are the nukes? And the answer is, thankfully, for now, they're pretty safe, because we have this, very well run team looking after them. I think the question is, how long would that last if you had a disorderly breakdown and a power struggle or a civil war? And one of the features of this unit that I mentioned earlier is that information is held very closely, and every man on his way down the chain is really not only not encouraged but not allowed to consider the bigger picture, and therefore, there's active. They're actively trained not to think strategically. So that's fine when you have a clear line of command. But when you don't, when there's a power struggle going on, that leads to potentially a unit that is frozen, that doesn't know what to do, that's vulnerable to either, whether it's coercion or manipulation at the top. If the commander falls in with one crowd or another or is held hostage, then we really don't know what would happen. So this unit managed to survive the transition of power of the collapse of the Soviet Union, but that was fairly peaceful. They went through a period where wages weren't paid, but there wasn't like a civil war going on. So, how long would they last in that situation? We really have no idea.
Well, and also the Shiget, the military briefcase that's kind of the nuclear big red button that needs to be pressed for the nukes to be launched. The people that grant the authority are three people: the Russian president, the defense minister, and the chief of the general staff, which right now is Putin, Shoigu, and Gerasimov. But Shoigu and Gerasimov would likely just do whatever Putin, wants them to do, really. Whereas if Prigozhin or someone else similar maybe fell into power, the processes for the way that would have to be launched might change, or it
Exactly.
might not be as predictable.
Yeah, it's very unclear. I mean, we're assuming right now that well, there's several assumptions. The first is that, as far as we know, the process for activating the Fragate, the nuclear button, hasn't changed, and I think that is correct because Putin's kind of signaled. He's put out press photos of himself with the two guys who would have to co-authorize the use of nuclear weapons. To signal that he has that power. But just as you say, if it weren't Putin, or if it were Putin that there was an attempted palace coup going on, or he were incapacitated somehow, what would those other guys do? We have no idea. And that's a very destabilizing situation. As far as the 12th Gumo is concerned, the commander of that takes his military orders directly from the chief of the general staff, the head of the army, Gerasimov, at the moment. But in a situation where there was, probably probably the 12th Gumo would be loyal to what the general chief of staff was saying. On the other hand, if you had a situation where the president and the minister of defense and the chief of staff were split, it's not clear what the 12th Gumo's orders are or what the commander would do.
I mean, how tested will the Russian deep state, places like the 12th Gumo that remain in Russia post the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Putin falls, how much will they be tested?
It depends. If it turns out that all of the main power centers in Russia, the other elites, as well as important elements like the Chechen military leaders, if they can all roughly coalesce around a replacement candidate, then it should be fairly straightforward. But because Putin is a paranoid dictator and it's a problem that we've always seen with dictatorships that have no clear succession plan. Once you have too much power and too many enemies, you can't actually put in place a succession plan. Firstly, because it then gives people a clear route if they want to get rid of you. But secondly, it then, the person who is your named successor, either they start to usurp you already, or they themselves become the target of undermining attempts and rivalries. So, because, and this is really the biggest weakness of dictatorships as a politically stable form of governance, is what do you do when the guy at the top dies or is moved on? And we just don't know.
Well, especially with Prigozhin, I mean, I think a lot of people last weekend were watching, maybe with horror or maybe with a bit of amusement at what he was attempting to do. But actually, he could be much more ruthless than Putin. And a lot of people have predicted that the person that comes after Putin might not be better. He actually might be much, much worse.
Yeah, it's certainly true that Putin faces no real pressure from the liberal left sort of pro-Western side of Russian politics, which is really marginal at this point. The main pressure he faces is from the hard right, what we call the nationalists, although I think more accurately we'd probably call them the imperialists because they support a rebuilding of the Russian Empire. So it's likely that someone of that stripe will take over. But there are a lot of nuances within that. So Putin wields power because he's able to, he commands support across quite a wide range. I mean, until recently, he had the Wagner Group. He has the personal loyalty of Kadyrov, who's the commander of the Chechen military. He also has the support of the Russian Orthodox Church, which for legitimacy purposes in Russia is reasonably important. So, would a successor maybe of the hard right imperialist stripe, but we don't know whose loyalty they would command, and what the pressures on them would be. It might be that if they're coming under pressure from China, for example, 5 years down the line, there's pressure to shift policy on the West because they need players to play off against each other. So although I think we can say there's not going to be a pro-Western leader in Russia, that's not something we should expect. What the practical pressures on the next leader will be, we can't make assumptions about right now.